Format today, we have a small audience, so it's going to be a bit interactive, but also it remains quite tutorially in a way. And we'll explore how we design basically the continuous learning experience to generate intelligence, and how the maps help to explore that. So how does an organization learn? And I posted this on LinkedIn. The idea of knowledge work, so basically the work where people think, and most services, tertiary type sector, tech, or about people thinking. And really the organization that learn the most are the ones that win. Very simple perspective. But in knowledge work, that's actually what we're going to somehow demonstrate today. And we'll look to work with map. So, you're familiar with maps here, but the idea that there is a view of visibility of the value chain, the vertical view of a map. And the most important view is the horizontal view, basically aligning things between genesis, custom-built product, and commodity. And there are different ways also of tagging this chain at the bottom. That can be around emergence and then consolidation. And what we see in knowledge is exactly that. So there's a maturity and movement, and we'll explore what that means in terms of knowledge and intelligence. So when we think about map as Genesis is inventing something new, experimenting, then we have an inertia of crossing the chasm, finding clients, making what we sell. So we are making something custom, then basically consolidating as a product, and then the go-to market and so on happens. And of course, some people will say, well, we can be a fast follower, meaning that they need to scan weak signals and adapt quickly to enter a market that others may have opened, and they didn't do the discovery themselves, but they are playing catch up quickly and potentially disrupting the people that opened up the market. And already scanning weak signal is a form of continuous learning. And many organizations will tell you they're a fast follower, but are they continuously learning or they are continuously scanning? And then if you think about the inertia factors of the evolution, this is a learning point every time. And it's very difficult actually to jump into a custom or even a product if you haven't learned through the journey. Because as the things are getting more and more complex, it's not like you can buy your way very easily in, or you can buy the knowledge, or there's repeatable knowledge. You need to create the knowledge. So every inertia point is effectively a learning experience. Learning to what actually works, learning to what can actually attract clients, and learning what can scale. And that's pretty much the journey. Now, quick question to you. How does your organization organizes its learning? Quick question out there. And it's okay to say, we don't do that very well.
I've recently moved from one organization to another, so I'm not going to mention names. But I think in both cases, frequently organizational learning isn't very structured. It'll be people share their stories. And the way they share their stories will, there will be no, how do I say this? There's no like process for it or like this is the way you do it. It's just people share on like internal communication platforms like Slack or like SharePoint or or they'll post a video to like Confluent or something like that. And actually, there hasn't even been an information architecture that sits within. It's just kind of people share it within a team or group, or maybe announce it and share it and stuff like that. But that's how it's learned outside of sort of dedicated team context where it'll be ad hoc, per team.
And that's the fantastic adaptability of humans, sharing stories, learning from that. but also the knowledge in your organization is in people's head. It's not something that stays in your organization necessarily, or is structured and captured. And Dave Snowden has done a lot of work on that, which is very interesting. Thank you for this. And if so, we're going to look at a few use cases. One is about organizing the learning, and the other one is developing the business advantage with the intelligence you generate. And here I played a bit of a scenario. Um, and then the intelligence of being a utility. So the intelligence you can create and the gravitational pull of knowledge you create when you are a utility. So we look at those. So organizing the learnings and maps, one key element, and I was working with a CTO recently, and that really spoke to him. When they're trying to go one size fit all for all projects, appreciating that there are things that are on the uncharted space of a map, and you approach them through agile ways and iterating and learning your way through the journey. Then there are things that are more established, but you can keep on eking through them and finding continuous improvement, reducing waste, and so on. And that is typically very badly done in organizations, except manufacturing, but in the service and tech industry, generally badly done. And then it's the last steps of basically scaling and making things work very, very, very seamlessly. And again, yes, we tend to, in software engineering, to have quality and so on, but we tend also to leave bugs and don't necessarily go to the last mile of fixing things industrially. And that's where the sort of Six Sigma things type play is finding those last little improvements. But when the journey of bigger improvements conflicts with that, sometimes it doesn't get done. And if we look at another way, and I mentioned Dave Snowden, if we look at Kinevin, the framework, there's a way of creating domains around the knowledge. So the central domain, and it's not a quadrant, it's actually domains, and there's 5 domains, so it cannot be quadrant. The domain at the center is aporetic and confused, which was disorder, I think, before. And the idea is you're trying to make sense of a situation. So you're actually gauging that situation. And then the type of domains you got is, if we start with clear, things have been understood, they're repeatable, and when you face a decision, you sense, you categorize into what the ways of working are defined, and you respond. It's a space of best practice and fixed constraints, typically. Complicated is there are things out there that have been worked out as well, but only some people with expertise tend to know them, or actually you need to analyze root cause and so on of those problems, meaning that they're not really happening as they're supposed to. So you sense, analyze, and respond. It's a space of good practice and governing constraints. And then complexity, which is what we're dealing with very often, and sometimes we confuse complicated to complexity. Complexity and chaotic are more the unordered domain, which means that there is typically a new situation. There isn't necessarily the knowledge or the data available. And what you tend to do is you probe, you create the data by trying things of a smallish nature that you then try and make sense and amplify. So you probe, you sense, you respond, and it's what they call exaptive practice. And previously, I think it was called emerging practice here. But the idea is exactive is you try and from the branches as well, and bring the things from the things but combine them in different ways to create new ideas. And then finally, the enabling constraints here. Meaning that you look at shifting the constraints to shift behavior in a slightly different way and see if you're getting different results. So the term enabling constraints is also a bit confusing because we tend to think of constraints being limiting, but they can also be enabling, which is interesting. And finally, chaotic is basically not as structure, is you try and regain stability and get into one of the other domains. So you tend to act and sense whether you stabilized and then response, and then you start distributing your response type in other domains. But the good thing about chaotic is that there is no constraints. So if things are all down, there is no constraints. And therefore you can allow novel practices. Sometimes you do things in a complete different way to restore something that is down, and effectively you bypass constraints. But that means innovation can happen. So the people that or or innovative, sometimes they have this dive into making something a bit chaotic because it removes constraints and you can think outside of the box. Whereas the rest may have a bounded applicability, which kind of keeps you in the box. And in complexity, you talk about permeability boundaries so that you kind of pick behind the box sometimes. So that's Kinevin. That is generally extremely good to get a sense of a situation before making decisions in it. Um, and the map gets you a sense of the landscape. So if you think about Kinevin and applying Kinevin, you tend to have, when you don't know, you create a portfolio of micro probes or bets, little bets, and through repetition, they will converge. And then you start amplifying things that you see are working, which through validation and cadencing. And then you look to actually standardize and scale what becomes a safe bet. So you're not making a big bet, you're making a safe bet because you had the learning journey happening. And of course, you need to always figure how you avoid complacency once you have established something, because when the landscape changes, maybe what you establish is no longer fit for it. So how does that look on a map? And I see clients very often approaching things as big bets. AI is a big thing, it's going to be big in the future, therefore we need to invest a lot. So everything is a large ticket. It has big attention. There are also amigos at play. People want to know that they are working on a big thing. They want to have a big team. They want to handle big budgets because that's what makes you a big person in an organization. And of course, when all this adds up, you need to get it right. And in projects approach, things are generally aligned like that. People want the big projects that have big attentions for the big promotion. And of course, if they don't get it right, that's a problem. So every project tries to get everything done, everything right, therefore upfront analysis and so on. Now, if we think about agile teams, the agile teams are doing essentially, and we have product managers, so they are product approach. They are very much in that product space and they iterate on features. So they are doing some improvements, even if Kaizen is not necessarily very well done there, but generally they are iterating on features. And much more could be done with Kaizen. So we're continuously improving, continuously stretching a bit what we do, but how far do agile team really go? And in the principles of agile, in the thinking of teams, we like to think we're experimenting and genesis and so on, but do we really? I see a lot of teams delivering continuous smallish iterations of things, maybe deploying some product, bigger steps, but sometimes they're done more like projects than actually continuous innovation. So the challenge is who takes charge of that part. And if you think about, and that's supposed to be a funnel here, but if you think about lean startup, it's this idea of having basically things you're experimenting and progressively they are getting their way to becoming a solution through the experimentation. And the key is, and I think that's where the product team limitation is the product team tends to explore basically within the boundary of a product so that they're going to eke out improvements. But how do you do radical innovation, exaptation? So recombine things of the company in a completely different way. So our, let's say, I don't know, McDonald's or KFC or the food industry explores not just selling food, but explore using their real estate to sell, I don't know, merchandising and things like that as well. So exploring beyond the boundaries of the business. And here, of course, you need to generate the learning. So all that journey has learning points. So if you think from a journey of creating the knowledge, and the important thing here is thinking the knowledge doesn't necessarily exist. We're going to need to create it as we go along. And therefore, we need to multiply the experimentation up front. From that experimentation, consolidate onto something that may be custom built. And maybe we combine some of them to become something else. And then eventually we have to make some choices. And every time there is essentially a journey, there is inertia, and the learning is actually what's going to create the movement. So generating the safe to fail experiment, amplifying what works to consolidate on something, and then productizing through repetition and consolidating even more. And then basically making choices to say what is going to be the standard that we're going to scale with and optimize. And that in itself is a learning journey. And the intelligence happens at every steps through the maturity cycle. So in Wardley Map, there was this language of pioneer, settler, stand planner, which I think now has changed because of certain connotations here to explorers, villagers, and planners. And the idea is they take, kind of a space, but what's more important is how does it evolve in between those? And it's worthwhile to think how do you organize those teams and whether some teams will do exploring and villagers or villagers and planners, but how do you manage those transitions? And the explorers are overstanding, sometimes you're overextending agile teams into that space. Sometimes you run innovation teams, cross-team hackathons, radical exaptation. So basically some teams will reassemble things in a different way to see what they could offer, and you experiment there. You will have weak signal detection. You may have venture capital also engagements. The startups really function in that. But in businesses, you need to actually have an approach that is more venturing in order to really occupy this space. And then there's timing and luck. Let's not kid ourselves. A lot of things are about timing, and sometimes it's about luck. You are at the right time with the right thing when the market demands it, and it takes off. Was it clever? Yes, it was. Some things were clever, but at a different time, it wouldn't have worked. The villagers and settlers, those things have been discovered now, and it's about repeating and consolidating on them. So continuous improvement, feature iterations, working from the customer feedback, and then seeing as well in relation to the competition, how you differentiated, how do you have parity at the very least, how do you market to make the perception that you're different, and how do you consolidate capability? And then the last mile around, the scaling and so on is cost optimization, scaling, high availability, reputation, bundling, market consolidation, etc. And it's interesting that in the middle, you consolidate the capability of a product to become a product. And in the last one, you consolidate the market in terms of people taking market share. So the question is, and maybe, do you recognize that? Does that speak to you around the journey of creating the intelligence, the journey of knowledge that eventually gets you to create effectively the intelligence from what's happening and in the context of evolving? Does that ring a bell? Does that work?
Makes
Well,
sense.
makes sense for sure. It's a very good presentation, by the way.
Thank you. Cool. So if that makes sense, let's explore a bit further. And we got limited time, so I'm going to go quite fast. Exploiting the intelligence for business advantage. And back in the day, I've always been into marketing and real-time marketing and so on. And if you think about a simple map, a web surfer, they're gonna get an advert, and ideally, as personalized to them. There's a placeholder, a real estate on a website with an advert. There's a promotion that is gonna get in it, and that promotion is a random pick around some brand campaigns you may have. And what happened then is you'd have more context matching with the session events, and you try and bring basically, you're going to rely on the brand cookie, but based on what they're doing in the session, you're going to try and make that campaign pick a little bit more pertinent to the person. And maybe it's an area on a website or things like this, where you're going to do some matching about what is the content about. We're going to present those campaigns. Now, if we think there's real-time marketing engines, that also have segmentation. They rely on session events, they rely on the brand campaigns to display, but they will also go into the customer profile and history of interaction with the brands. So suddenly it's no longer just what's happening in the session, it's what's happening in the history of that customer. And I've done a dotted line here because I've worked on many of those things. And the complexity that this involves, very often, you have people doing a couple of segments and so on and running all the rest on default campaign, which is a big waste of investment when you have those type of capabilities. And of course, pushing this further, you have matching algorithms, customer DNA model with some sort of inferences, where the inference is, we don't know very much about you, but because of the people you're friend with, and we know about them, we infer that this is what interests you. And the likes of Yahoo and so on, and I worked a bit with, when he was in Barclays, Oussama Fayed, who was the CDO of Yahoo before, and super interesting guy around what they were doing in Yahoo to capture a customer profile. And they had this, what they used to call a DNA strand. And of course, that's populated from your searches, your social traces, your site visited, inferences from your friends, and so on. And you have network cookies to actually track you across the internet, not just from one website, but across the internet. And of course, now they're developing AI models as well from that. So the idea here is, for that one little placeholder, what's the best conversion likelihood? And of course, who is going to win the prize to actually advert into there because they can pay the real estate, the virtual real estate, a bit more based on the intelligence they bring into it. So here we see that the people that bring more intelligence into using that real estate will be actually the ones winning the conversions and being able to charge more for the promotion they are going to present. So how do you maximize knowledge, turn into intelligence to extract the most value of your customer touchpoints? Because the real estate's all the same, but what happens below that creates, how much you're ready to pay for it, how much you can actually pay, because you're going to get the return based on the campaign being more effective. How much intelligence do you place behind that so you're able to keep pace with what people are ready to pay? It may be a difficult question. Does that ring a bell?
I think it's a good question. I mean, I'm like a technology person, so it's a question of how do you get the most value out of individuals working in engineering teams. That's normally the way I would see this. But I mean, you're saying like, how do we extract the most learning we have about our market and the people that we're selling value to so that we can maximize the value we bring to them, like based on that knowledge we're acquiring.
And there's a capital flow, right? Because as you maximize that knowledge, there will be a maximum value that you can sell for, you can charge for at that point. With the metaphor, the exemplar of a placeholder for advertising here works also for engineers. In order to retain that engineer, how do you maximize them doing interesting work? How do you stretch them? How do you maximize their relationship? How do you maximize, and you can only achieve that if you maximize the value they create for the business. So in order to be able to afford that engineer and the best engineers out there, you need to maximize the use of them for the value to create in the business.
Yes. I think, I think to pose the question, I've never seen an organization explicitly manage this. I think it tends to be ad hoc / haphazard, or it happens almost by accident. And I think going back to what you were saying, well, okay, the way I like to think about it is where people get attached to what they do. So they're not creating an optimization problem. They kind of select the first thing they see or know, and then they sell what they know, and then they get attached to it, rather than treat anything that they might know as possibly useful. Because then when you do that and you're thinking about things probabilistically, the right thing to do is to get a set and find a way to optimize the set, and then find a way to validate that and share it internally in the most effective way possible. Because it comes down to knowledge management and the friction of sharing knowledge, which is, in technology, that's very difficult. How do you find the right thing to share with everybody? I think it's a platform engineering problem, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make that as frictionless as possible? Because that's what enables teams to go fast from the technical plane. And I think the same obviously applies for the product marketing service level per what we know about customers and what the market's doing.
So it'd be interesting to map that, to be explicit around how do we maximize basically the value, and in your case of software engineering, but are the software engineers. So that's to maximize the knowledge they've got, but maximize the value that we can actually create with that knowledge.
If I may answer in a
Go ahead, go ahead.
slightly different way, and it's both perhaps for engineers and for real estate. Perhaps to get the most value of this touch point, the knowledge will have to represent aspirations in general, because capturing value, it's my aim. Also from engineers and from the market of real estate. Perhaps a single point to maximize upon would be aspiration. They want to change their position in the company as engineers, or they want to buy something more attractive, useful in terms of real estate.
And
I'm showing the point as such, not the mechanics.
the interesting thing here is to think, how do you match those, that the maximization of the intelligence of the value chains, that is an engineer in that case, how do you make sure this applies to the maximum value realization for the business? Because economically, that needs to add up, right? You need to develop the engineer that you're going to pay more for. They need to add more value to the business to justify that uptick. And I'm not saying we have the answer here, but with this example, the idea is there may be ways to map it. And, it was a simple case with a real estate placeholder with marketing, but that may apply to actually the engineering intelligence of people and their knowledge and so on, and the knowledge of the architecture and how things connect. How do we maximize that to maximize the value to the business? And sometimes those things are disconnected. People maximize their value themselves, that they work better, they create less waste, better value, and so on, better clean systems. But actually, the business doesn't recognize that and doesn't leverage that. So maybe some interesting case that you're taking it in a different perspective, which I absolutely love, because I love working with effectiveness of teams and people, and especially in the context of tech and services. And I might actually spend my afternoon trying to map that. So thank you for this. But you're taking it in, that's something we can look at multi points. Is how do we maximize the point of value by maximizing the intelligence we have, that we're bringing to the table? Last little case around I call that the intelligence monopoly. And it's just thinking about the gravitational pull of cloud providers and big tech players. And if you think about a new service, we've been told, and rightly so, that you use utilities where they are available, especially the cloud providers, because you can really concentrate on growing your business side. And the cloud provider will remove a lot of the cognitive overload you may have otherwise to try and maintain your service and run your own systems and so on. And indeed, if you want to innovate, you push that aside and you have the environments to work on. Now, that indeed enables new order items. And the thing is, you're creating a trace of data usage. And that trace of data gives insight to the cloud providers as to an early weak signal detection as to which new services are actually really good. And they may acquire company with minimal inertia to actually bring them as a next SaaS capabilities on top of their cloud. So the cloud providers have a very, very fast industrialization cycle by using data that they know about because people use the cloud as part of their services. And of course, it gives negotiation power because they're also able to create things or they can negotiate with other new services to bring them as part of their cloud. And once a service becomes part of the cloud, the other services are unlikely to be very successful once it's integrated as part of a cloud service. So effectively, what the cloud providers can do through the use of intelligence is identify those new microservices that they can bring as next SaaS PaaS capabilities and add on to their cloud. And they grow their ecosystem that way. So, at the start of Amazon Web Services, there were some core services, and very quickly, like a couple of years later, they had 1,500 plus services available on top of the cloud. So that cycle can go extremely quick. And playing with this map, I was thinking, so what with AI? So now we have a cloud provider, they have usage data, they have SaaS services, and any new startup that happens, creates some new SaaS service very quickly that may get integrated into the space of the cloud provider. But now with AI, we create AI agents that use the AI capability that has usage data and training models. And those training models can basically turn those AI agents as AI services relatively quickly. And the transfer of expertise intelligence has basically no inertia because we run things onto a training model. What stops the provider to then making this available as part of the AI service? So that loop we saw about acquiring and companies and so on and rapid sort of industrialization of things, with the AI, it's almost built in. So if you think, that ecosystem grows by itself daily, continually. And very often, those agents you have, you're going to develop businesses that are going to depend on AI agents. And many of those businesses will end up as being commodity services. And in the meantime, every business is ending up paying an AI dependency tax in a way, because we now rely so much on those commodities. And the sort of Amazon Prime feels like every business is going to have to pay that to actually keep creating businesses on top of AI businesses. It's a bit dystopian, isn't it? But how the intelligence is cycling that much faster, and now with AI, there is no inertia. So what do you think? What about your parting thoughts about building an advantage using intelligence?
I think, I mean, I think there's a lot to think here, especially with AI. I think there's a lot of risk with AI, I think, at the moment, because I don't think we understand how to manage it well enough. Because from my perspective, people are basically throwing large language models specifically actually at problems and seeing what sticks. And because of the way those large language model providers are funded, let's say, we actually don't know what the real cost will be. Yeah, but I still think for those of us who are like trying to find value out of artificial intelligence, large language models, there are the things underneath that allowed those to happen, which I think is the real innovation. Because regardless of whether large language models are valuable or not, we now have the ability to compute at scale. Like we can take the whole internet and process the whole internet to generate a large language model. That means we're no longer we don't have enough data. We can take all the data. If you've got the capital, you can do all the data, and the ability to do that is getting less expensive. So to the point, the better we're able to structure and manage knowledge, right? the better the competitive advantage we have. And all those things you point to, where those who have that capability are then better able to see things and react to them than other people, where you've got the all like the monopolization on capability. So, for example, if one day I'm going to pick on Anthropic because they released Mythos recently and they keep scaring everybody. But if their AI was as good as they said it would be, then they don't need to sell the AI. They can provide an infinite set of services that people are using AI to build, right? Because they've trivialized problem solving and software and services. So they don't need to sell it. They just sell the services.
Exactly
And
that.
that is a scary, it's a scary future. We don't know. I think it's unlikely we'll get there, but it's a chance it could happen. So,
Thank
but
you.
but but we
And
need to
that's the sense of that last map. There's a possibility it could happen. And that means the big tech is getting way bigger.
But I
And
think,
it goes back to my original point that in the knowledge work, the companies that manage the most learning win.
yeah, yeah. I think as well, like just on the topic of using Wardley maps, like if you take this, I mean, I suppose it's out of my pay grade, but I mean, if you look at it from like a business risk management perspective, if that starts to happen, then how does regulation change the shape of the technology industry to manage that? Because obviously, if you're governments, you don't want that to happen, right? And you're going to try and regulate it. And then there's a relationship between companies, how they lobby government agencies, and how that then changes the landscape. So, for example, do they turn to someone like Amazon and say, look, you're too big, split up? And what does that mean for all of us who have all of our technology depend on, say, AWS? Like if they told Microsoft or AWS split up or change in some way as a reaction to, let's call it the intelligence explosion, um, what does that mean for us and how we build and compose solutions? Like that's a big technology headache right there.
I'm not sure the regulator moves fast enough for it, and I'm not sure that the anti-monopoly laws are actually adapted to knowledge work and understanding our knowledge. The monopoly is around knowledge. Is no longer around the product necessarily, it's around the knowledge. Um, Difficult one. And we're not going to solve it today, but the intention was to appreciate intelligence and working with surfacing and explicitly understanding where is the intelligence coming from. How do we create the intelligence through the maturity cycle, and how sometimes we need to generate it, but also how it's circling a lot faster. And the cloud providers building basically very big services around their cloud. And now with AI and the speed at which it could happen with very, very little inertia, because we are training the model and the model becomes a service, it's quite scary. It's quite scary. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
I wish you a great weekend. Thank you for being here. And the next one will be around the value chains. So looking at seeing the value chains through and how to match the organization model to the strategy.